exploring another fascinating piece of history that time forgot. We're diving deep into the brutal reality of surviving winter as a medieval peasant in 14th century England. It's a story of endurance, resourcefulness, and the daily dance with death that define the coldest months of the year. Before we begin, if you enjoy these deep dives into forgotten lives, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more historical bedtime stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some white noise, and let's settle in for a journey back to a time when winter wasn't just a season, but a months-long battle for survival. Close your eyes and let yourself drift back to November 1347 as a medieval peasant, as the first killing frost settles over your small village and you realise that another winter has begun. The first frost, November's warning. You wake up on a November morning to find frost covering everything, the inside walls of your cottage, your breath visible in white puffs, and a thin layer of ice on the water bucket that sat by your bedside. The frost creates delicate crystalline patterns that might be beautiful if they weren't such an ominous sign of what's to come. You can trace intricate designs with your fingertip on the frozen surfaces, watching the ice melt under the warmth of your touch, only to refreeze moments later. This is your warning that winter has officially begun, though honestly you've been preparing for months. The local birds have long since disappeared, either migrated south or huddled deep in whatever shelter they could find. Even the mice that usually scurry through your walls have grown quieter, as if they too understand the gravity of the season ahead. In medieval England, winter preparation isn't a casual affair. It's the difference between seeing spring and becoming another casualty of the cold season that claims lives as regularly as harvest time brings grain. Your one-room cottage, shared with your parents, 3 siblings, and occasionally your grandmother when her joints ache too much for her to manage alone in her own dwelling, suddenly feels impossibly small and impossibly cold. Every family member seems to take up more space when bundled in layers of wool and fur, creating a cramped environment where privacy becomes impossible and tempers grow short with the shortened days. The wattle and daub walls, that charming mixture of sticks, mud and animal dung that passes for construction material, do almost nothing to keep out the bitter wind that finds every crack and crevice with the determination of water finding its way downhill. You know every drafty spot by heart now. The corner where your younger sister sleeps always gets the worst of it, requiring extra bedding that the family can barely spare. You've stuffed rags and straw into the worst gaps, using precious materials that might have served other purposes. But winter air has a way of finding entrance no matter how carefully you've sealed things. Sometimes you wake to find new cracks have appeared overnight, as if the cold itself is actively working to invade your shelter. The thatched roof above your head, which seemed adequate during warmer months, when a few drips were merely annoying rather than potentially deadly, now becomes a source of constant anxiety. You lie awake during storms, listening to the wind testing each bundle of straw, each twisted reed, wondering if tonight will be the night your ceiling gives way to the elements. Every gust of wind threatens to tear away the carefully woven straw and reeds that your father spent weeks preparing and installing just a few months ago, back when the weather was cooperative and ladder work didn't require risking frostbite. The thatching has already begun to settle and shift, creating new gaps that weren't there in September. When it rains, which it does frequently and miserably, water drips through in a dozen places, creating puddles on your dirt floor that freeze solid by morning, making walking treacherous and turning your living space into an obstacle course of ice patches that never quite melt during the brief, weak daylight hours. Your daily routine transforms completely with winter's arrival, as if you've entered an entirely different world with its own harsh rules and morning schedule. Gone are the long days in the fields where you could work until the sun set, where there was always something productive to do, where the rhythm of agricultural life provided structure and purpose. Instead, your existence revolves around the central fire pit that dominates your cottage like a temperamental deity that must be constantly appeased. This fire is literally the difference between life and death, a responsibility that weighs heavily on every family member, and someone must tend it constantly throughout the long, dark months ahead. The fire pit, lined with stones your father carefully selected for their ability to retain and radiate heat, becomes the heart around which all other activities orbit. Usually this duty falls to whoever is least useful for other winter tasks, which often means you, as the youngest family member capable of keeping flames alive without burning down the house or wasting precious fuel through inexperience. The responsibility is terrifying in ways that wake you in the middle of the night, heart racing with worry about coals that might be dying while you sleep. Let the fire die, and you'll spend precious fuel and time getting it started again. Time during which everyone's body temperature drops dangerously and spirits sink lower than they already are. You've learned to read the fire like others read faces, understanding exactly how much fuel to add, when to bank the coals for overnight burning, how to adjust airflow to maximise heat while conserving wood. Worse, if the fire dies on a particularly cold night, people can freeze to death in their sleep, their bodies unable to generate enough warmth to survive in an unheated shelter when temperatures plummet. You've heard stories of entire families found dead in their beds after a fire went out during a blizzard, their bodies peaceful but frozen solid, clutching each other for warmth that never came. These aren't distant tales from far-off places. They're warnings from neighbouring villages, reminders of what happens when winter's vigilance lapses for even a few hours. Sweet dreams. December. When cold becomes survival, December arrives with the kind of cold that makes you question whether humans were ever meant to live this far north. A cold that seems to penetrate not just your clothing and shelter, but your very bones, settling there like an unwelcome guest who has no intention of leaving. The air itself becomes sharp and hostile, turning each breath into a visible cloud that dissipates quickly in the frigid atmosphere. The temperature inside your cottage hovers just barely above freezing, which means everything is constantly damp, constantly uncomfortable, and constantly threatening to freeze solid. Your sleeping area, a pile of straw covered with whatever animal skins your family has accumulated over years of careful saving, trading, and the occasional stroke of luck, becomes a nest that you reluctantly leave each morning and gratefully return to each night. The straw beneath the skins has been compressed into a relatively comfortable surface, though it requires daily fluffing to maintain any insulation value, and sometimes you find ice crystals forming, even there when the night temperatures drop especially low. Waking up becomes a daily exercise in courage that requires genuine mental preparation, like a warrior steeling himself before battle. You lie still for several minutes each morning, knowing that movement will only make the transition from warm to cold more jarring, yet understanding that delaying the inevitable only makes the day shorter and the tasks more difficult to complete. You know that the moment you leave the relative warmth of your bedding, carefully arranged to trap body heat through the night, the cold will hit you like a physical blow that takes your breath away and makes your muscles contract involuntarily. The shock never gets easier, no matter how many mornings you've endured it. Your bare feet touch a dirt floor that's hard as stone, packed solid by months of foot traffic, and now frozen into an unforgiving surface that seems to actively draw heat from your body through your soles. Your breath immediately becomes visible in thick white puffs that hang in the air like small ghosts, and process that requires not just technical skill, but genuine artistry and an understanding of fire's temperamental nature. This requires skill learned through trial and error, and the occasional minor burn, patience that must be cultivated despite chattering teeth and numb fingers, and a healthy respect for how quickly things can go wrong when you're dealing with fire in a dwelling made primarily of flammable materials. You carefully uncover the coals buried in ash, using a wooden stick to gently probe the grey surface until you find the red glow that means survival. Blow gently to encourage a flame, while being careful not to scatter ash everywhere, or blow too hard and extinguish the precious embers. Add small kindling piece by piece in a careful sequence that you've learned through months of practice, and pray to whatever saints handle fire-related emergencies that today won't be the day everything goes catastrophically wrong. The process can take anywhere from a few minutes to half an hour, depending on how well the fire was banked the night before, and how cooperative the weather is being with drafts and air pressure. Breakfast, when there is breakfast, and when the family can afford to spare the fuel for cooking rather than just warmth, consists of whatever can be prepared quickly without wasting precious fuel that must last through the entire winter season. Often, it's a thin porridge made from barley or oats, grain that's been carefully rationed and stored since harvest time, stretched with water to make the precious grain supplies last longer through the dark months ahead. Sometimes dried peas or beans are added when available, providing variety and additional nutrition that helps stave off the weakness that comes from months of limited diet. The porridge is barely warm by the time you eat it. Keeping it hot would require keeping the fire burning higher and longer, and fuel must be conserved for the long months ahead, when even finding dry wood becomes a significant challenge. You eat quickly, not because you're eager to start your day, or because the food is particularly appealing, but because warm food becomes cold food frighteningly fast in a house where the walls are essentially decorative and offer minimal protection against the elements. The wooden bowl feels cold in your hands, even when filled with hot porridge, and you learn to cup your fingers around it to steal a few moments of warmth before the food cools completely. Getting dressed is a strategic operation that would challenge a military tactician planning a complex siege, requiring careful consideration of layering, insulation, and the day's planned activities. You layer every piece of clothing you own, multiple tunics made from rough wool that scratches but insulates, 2 pairs of woolen leggings if you're fortunate enough to have them, and if they haven't developed holes that let in drafts, whatever cloaks and shawls can be found or borrowed from family members. Each layer must be arranged carefully to trap warm air, while still allowing enough freedom of movement to perform necessary tasks. The goal isn't fashion or even comfort. Concepts that become irrelevant when survival is at stake. It's creating as much insulation as possible between your skin and the hostile world outside, building a portable shelter from fabric and wool that you carry with you throughout the day. Your hands become a particular source of misery that affects every aspect of daily life, making simple tasks complicated and painful tasks nearly unbearable. The constant cold causes painful cracks in your skin that bleed regularly and never quite heal, creating open wounds that sting constantly and are prone to infection. The skin around your knuckles becomes thick and rough, splitting when you bend your fingers, leaving raw patches that burn when exposed to air. You wrap them in strips of cloth when you can spare the fabric, creating crude mittens that provide minimal protection but are better than nothing, but mostly you just accept that your hands will hurt continuously from November until March, a constant reminder of winter's grip on your life. Medieval winter gloves are a luxury your family can't afford, items that might as well be made of gold for all the the likelihood of acquiring them, so you learn to work with fingers that are either numb from cold, and therefore clumsy and unreliable, or stinging from the pain of briefly warming up, which somehow hurts worse than the numbness. You develop techniques for warming your hands quickly, breathing on them, tucking them under your arms, holding them near the fire for brief moments, but the relief is always temporary, and the return of cold seems even more brutal after these brief reprieves. January, the depth of winter. January is when winter stops pretending to be merely uncomfortable and reveals its true murderous intent, like a predator that has been stalking its prey and finally decides to move in for the kill. This is the month when people die, not from any single dramatic event that might at least provide a story worth telling, but from the slow accumulation of cold, hunger, and exhaustion that gradually overwhelms their body's ability to cope, wearing them down like water slowly eroding stone until there's nothing left to sustain life. The deaths are quiet, unremarkable. An elderly neighbour who simply doesn't wake up one morning, a child who grows thinner and weaker until they stop moving altogether, a mother who uses the last of her strength to feed her family and has nothing left for herself. The cold is no longer something you feel. It's something you live inside, like being trapped in an ice cave that follows you everywhere you go, creating its own climate that exists independently of the actual weather outside. Your cottage, despite the constantly burning fire that consumes precious fuel at an alarming rate, maintains a temperature that would be considered uninhabitable by any reasonable standard from a warmer season. Ice forms on the walls inside your house in delicate fern-like patterns that would be beautiful if they weren't harbingers of death. Your water bucket freezes solid every night, despite being kept near the fire, requiring you to break through a thick layer of ice each morning just to access the water beneath. And your breath creates a constant fog that hangs in the air like a visible reminder of how close you are to simply freezing to death. Even the stones around the fire pit become so cold, they burn your skin when touched, creating a cruel irony where the things meant to provide warmth become sources of pain. Sleep becomes a challenge that requires strategy and teamwork, transforming what should be a natural restful activity into a complex survival exercise that must be planned and executed with military precision. Your family huddles together for warmth, sharing body heat like a pack of wolves who understand instinctively that separation means death, with the largest family members on the outside to shield the smaller ones from the worst of the cold. Privacy is a concept from a warmer world. Survival requires close physical contact with every family member, regardless of personal preferences or the normal social boundaries that govern human interaction during more comfortable times. You sleep wearing every piece of clothing you own, layered so thickly that movement becomes difficult, covered by every animal skin and piece of fabric in the house, creating a communal cocoon that traps whatever warmth your bodies can generate, and you still wake up shivering, your muscles stiff and aching from the constant tension of trying to stay warm. Sometimes you wake to find that someone's breath is frozen on the shared blankets, creating patches of ice that crackle when you move. Your mother, assuming she survived the various perils of medieval womanhood, childbirth, disease, accidents, and the general wear of hard labour that ages women rapidly in this era, becomes a master of winter resource management, developing skills that would impress modern efficiency experts. Every piece of food is rationed with mathematical precision that takes into account not just current hunger, but projected needs for the remaining winter months, the caloric requirements of different family members based on their size and activity levels, and the terrifying possibility that winter might last longer than expected. Every stick of firewood is counted and allocated like precious currency, with different types of wood reserved for different purposes. The hardwoods that burn long and hot for overnight heating, the quickly burning kindling for cooking fires, the green wood that produces more smoke but can stretch the fuel supply when properly mixed with seasoned timber. Every decision about heat, light, or cooking becomes a complex calculation involving the entire family's survival prospects, requiring her to balance immediate needs against future requirements while maintaining the morale necessary to keep everyone functional through the darkest months. Food takes on an almost mystical significance during these months, occupying your thoughts with an intensity that would seem obsessive in times of plenty, but becomes entirely rational when survival depends on every morsel. What were once 3 modest meals become 2 tiny portions that barely register in your stomach, then 1 small meal that must sustain you for the entire day, forcing your body to adapt to a state of constant semi-starvation. Your stomach learns to accept constant hunger as its natural state, a dull ache that becomes the background noise of your existence, as familiar and persistent as the sound of wind through the thatch or the crackling of the fire. You dream about food, not feast foods or exotic delicacies that were never part of your world anyway, but simple things, like a thick slice of bread that isn't stale, a bowl of hot soup with actual meat floating in it, or even just enough porridge to feel genuinely full for the first time in months. These dreams are so vivid you can taste the imaginary food, and waking up to the reality of empty bowls and rationed portions becomes a daily heartbreak. The hunger affects your mind as well as your body, creating changes that go far beyond simple physical discomfort. You find yourself thinking about food constantly, planning imaginary meals with the same detailed attention a craftsman might give to designing a cathedral, remembering in vivid detail every good meal you've ever eaten, cataloguing flavours and textures and the sensation of satisfaction that comes from having eaten enough. Your mental capacity shrinks to focus on the immediate concerns of warmth and sustenance, as if your brain has decided that higher thinking is a luxury it can no longer afford. Complex thoughts become difficult when your brain is operating on minimal fuel in constant cold, making it hard to plan beyond the next meal or the next load of firewood. Conversations become shorter and more practical, focused on survival rather than the social bonds that normally hold families and communities together. Your daily activities shrink to the absolute essentials, eliminating anything that isn't directly related to staying alive through another day. You tend the fire with obsessive attention, learning to read the flames and coals like a diviner reading omens, understand exactly when to add fuel and when to bank the fire for maximum efficiency. You prepare what food can be managed with minimal fuel, creating meals that prioritise caloric density over flavour or variety, combining whatever ingredients are available in ways that might have seemed unappetising in better times, but now represent the difference between strength and weakness. You do whatever small tasks can be accomplished in the cold, mending clothes with numb fingers, maintaining tools that might be needed when spring finally comes, checking and rechecking the security of your shelter against the elements. And you spend long hours simply sitting still to conserve energy, understanding that movement requires energy, and energy comes from food, and food is in critically short supply. These periods of enforced stillness become a kind of meditation, though not by choice. Your body simply cannot afford unnecessary motion when every calorie must be preserved for essential survival activities. February, the breaking point. February is when winter reveals its cruelest face, stripping away any pretense of mercy and showing itself as the relentless enemy it has always been. Your carefully hoarded supplies, calculated and recalculated through the autumn months with the precision of a merchant's ledger, have reached dangerously low levels that make every remaining resource seem impossibly precious. Every decision becomes a matter of life and death, requiring calculations that weigh immediate needs against future survival in ways that would challenge a philosopher's wisdom. Do you burn the last good firewood tonight to maintain enough warmth to sleep, or save it for when the cold gets even worse and risk freezing before morning? Do you eat an extra bit of porridge today to maintain your strength for the work that must be done, or stretch the grain another few days and risk collapse from malnutrition that might make all future work impossible? These choices follow you from morning until night, creating a constant state of anxiety that grinds away at your mental resilience like water wearing down stone. This is the month when families make the hardest decisions of the winter, choices that will haunt them for years if they survive to see spring and remember what they were forced to give up. Your last chicken, kept alive through the cold months in hopes of future eggs and the possibility of spring breeding, might need to be slaughtered for one precious meal of meat that will provide protein and warmth, but eliminate any hope of rebuilding the flock when warmer weather returns. The decision tears at your heart as you watch the bird huddle in its makeshift shelter, unaware that its life has become a calculation of immediate survival versus future prosperity. Your wooden stool, handmade by your father years ago during a time when craftsmanship mattered more than fuel, might need to go into the fire because fuel matters more than furniture when you're slowly freezing to death. And the sentimental value of hand-carved wood means nothing when the alternative is death from cold. Each piece of furniture that goes into the flames represents not just warmth, but the destruction of the life you've built, the reduction of your home to its most basic elements. Your body shows the accumulated damage of months in survival mode, displaying the physical cost of prolonged hardship in ways that would be shocking to anyone from a more comfortable season. Your skin is cracked and bleeding from constant cold and dryness, creating painful fissures that appear overnight and resist all attempts at healing. The cracks form patterns on your hands and face like tiny maps of suffering, each line a testament to winter's assault on human flesh. Your lips are so chapped they've become a series of small wounds that reopen every time you speak or attempt to eat, making even conversation painful and turning the simple act of consuming food into an exercise in endurance. Your hands shake constantly, not just from cold, but from the weakness that comes with prolonged malnutrition, making fine motor control nearly impossible and turning simple tasks like mending or cooking into exhausting challenges that require multiple attempts and endless patience. The psychological effects are perhaps worse than the physical ones, creating changes in your mental state that feel as threatening as any external danger. You move slowly, think slowly, as if your brain is partially frozen along with everything else in your world, operating at a reduced capacity that makes problem solving difficult and decision making exhausting. Simple tasks that would be automatic in warmer weather now require careful planning and multiple attempts, demanding attention and energy that you can barely spare. Getting dressed becomes a complex operation that requires planning, strategy, and careful sequencing to avoid losing precious body heat during the transition from sleep warmth to day cold. Preparing a meal demands the energy and focus of a military campaign, requiring you to coordinate fuel management, food preparation, heat conservation, and timing with the precision of a general planning a battle, all while operating with a mind slowed by cold and hunger. This is also when the village's social bonds become most crucial, revealing the underlying networks of mutual support that make survival possible in a world where individual families rarely have enough resources to weather the winter alone. Families share their last stores of food with neighbours who have run out completely, understanding that today's generosity might be repaid with tomorrow's survival when their own supplies fail. Someone whose fire has died receives hot coals from a household whose flames still burn, creating a web of interdependence that connects every dwelling in the village through threads of shared warmth and mutual aid. Children who have lost parents are quietly absorbed into other families without ceremony or legal formalities. Survival trumps bureaucracy when death is a daily visitor, and the normal social structures that govern adoption and family responsibility become irrelevant when faced with the immediate need to keep children alive. These arrangements happen naturally, without discussion or negotiation, driven by the understanding that community survival benefits everyone, and that abandoned children represent not just human tragedy, but wasted resources the community cannot afford to lose. The village blacksmith, whose forge provides one of the few sources of real heat in the community, becomes an unofficial gathering place where people congregate not just for metalwork, but for the life-giving warmth that radiates from his fire. People bring small tasks, mending a pot that probably doesn't really need mending, sharpening a knife that's already sharp enough, requesting repairs that could wait until spring, just for an excuse to stand nearer the fire for a few precious minutes and feel what it's like to be truly warm again. He tolerates this charity with good grace because he understands that community survival benefits everyone, including himself, and that a blacksmith with no living customers is just another man slowly freezing to death. His forge becomes a kind of secular cathedral where people worship at the altar of heat, standing in reverent silence as the flames dance and the metal glows red hot, absorbing warmth that will have to sustain them through the cold journey home. But even community support has limits when everyone is struggling with their own survival, and the harsh mathematics of winter eventually overwhelm even the strongest social bonds. Some neighbours who shared generously in December are themselves starving by February, their own reserves exhausted by the combined demands of their families and their generosity to others. Some households that seem secure in their preparations discover that their calculations were optimistic, that they underestimated consumption or overestimated supplies, or that unexpected disasters, a fire that consumed stored food, an injury that prevented necessary work, an illness that required extra fuel for warmth, have thrown their careful plans into chaos. Winter has a way of revealing exactly how much margin for error exists in medieval peasant life, which is to say, almost none, stripping away illusions of security and showing how thin the line is between survival and death, how quickly circumstances can change, and how little separates the prepared from the desperate when winter decides to test human endurance to its absolute limits. The daily struggle of winter survival. Let's talk about what a typical February day actually looks like when you're fighting for survival in a medieval cottage, when each moment becomes a calculated decision between competing needs and every action carries the weight of life or death consequences. You wake up if you manage to sleep through the cold that penetrates even your dreams, filling them with images of warmth and comfort that make waking even more cruel, to find that the fire has burned dangerously low despite someone's best efforts to keep it alive through the night, the precious coals barely glowing beneath a layer of grey ash that threatens to smother the last hope of warmth. Your first sensation isn't the comfort of waking up, the gradual transition from sleep to consciousness that should mark the beginning of a new day, but the sharp realization that you're colder now than when you went to sleep, as if the night has stolen warmth from your body and left you diminished, weaker, less capable of facing another day of survival challenges. The
person whose turn it was to tend the fire during the night. Often your grandmother, who can't sleep anyway, due to the cold settling into her joints like an unwelcome permanent resident that no amount of positioning or covering can dislodge, sits hunched over the barely glowing coals like a guardian spirit protecting the family's most precious possession. Her hands, gnarled from years of hard work and made even more painful by winter's assault, move with practiced precision as she tries to coax them back to life without wasting the precious dry kindling that must last until spring arrives, if it ever does. She understands the delicate balance required. Too little air, and the coals will die completely. Too much, and the flames will consume fuel too quickly, leaving the family with warmth now but cold death later. Her breathing is visible in small puffs as she works, and occasionally she pauses to blow on her hands, trying to restore enough feeling to continue her delicate manipulation of the fire's resurrection. You lie still for a few moments, gathering the courage to leave the relative warmth of your pile of blankets and animal skins, knowing that this daily transition represents one of the hardest parts of winter survival. This isn't procrastination, it's strategic delay, a calculated decision based on the understanding that warmth is a finite resource that must be conserved whenever possible. Every moment you stay covered is another moment of warmth conserved, another few seconds before the cold hits you like a physical assault that will make your muscles contract and your breath catch in your throat. You can hear the wind outside, testing the walls and roof of your cottage, searching for weaknesses with the persistence of a predator stalking wounded prey. The sound of it creates an underlying anxiety that never quite goes away, a constant reminder that your shelter is all that stands between your family and the killing cold that waits just beyond these thin walls. When you finally emerge from your bedding, marshalling your willpower like a soldier preparing for battle, the cold is so intense it takes your breath away and makes you gasp involuntarily, a sound that crystallizes in the frigid air. Your bare feet hit the dirt floor, which is frozen hard as stone and covered with a thin layer of frost that forms overnight despite the fire's presence, and the shock of it travels up your legs like lightning, making your muscles clench and your teeth chatter uncontrollably. You grab the first pieces of clothing within reach, probably the same clothes you've been wearing for weeks, since changing clothes would mean being naked in sub-freezing temperatures for long enough to pull off old garments and don new ones, which is essentially a form of suicide that no rational person would attempt. The clothes themselves are stiff with cold, feeling like frozen fabric armour that gradually warms to your body temperature, and they carry the musty smell of too many days of wear without washing. But cleanliness is a luxury that winter has eliminated from your list of priorities. Getting dressed is a careful operation, performed as close to the fire as possible without actually catching yourself ablaze. A real danger when dealing with long woolen garments, loose fabric ties, and an open flame that represents both salvation and potential destruction. You layer every piece of clothing you own, creating a complex system of insulation that must be assembled in the correct order to be effective. Undergarments first, then tunics, then outer layers, each one carefully arranged to trap warm air while allowing freedom of movement for the day's necessary tasks. You wrap strips of cloth around your feet before putting them into wooden clogs stuffed with straw for insulation, creating crude socks that provide some protection against the frozen ground, but never quite eliminate the bone-deep cold that seems to radiate up from the earth itself. Your hands, already stiff and painful from the cold that settles into joints and makes them ache continuously, struggle with ties and fastenings that would be simple in warmer weather, but now require multiple attempts and considerable patience preparations to complete successfully. Breakfast preparation begins with the daily calculation of fuel versus food, a mathematical problem that balances immediate nutrition against long-term survival, current hunger against future starvation. Cooking anything requires building up the fire, which consumes wood or dried dung that must last through many more weeks of winter when no new fuel can be gathered from the frozen landscape outside. The decision-making process involves the entire family, weighing factors like the weather forecast. Will it be cold enough today that warm food is essential for maintaining body temperature? The work planned. Do family members need extra energy for physical tasks? And the fuel supplies. How many more cooking fires can be sustained before running out completely? Often, the decision is made to eat food cold rather than waste fuel heating it. Cold porridge that has the consistency of thick paste and tastes like cardboard. Cold bread if there is bread, and if it hasn't frozen so hard it must be sucked rather than chewed. Cold water that makes your teeth ache and sends shivers through your entire body when swallowed. The meal itself is a small portion of whatever can be spared from the family's dwindling supplies, carefully measured to provide some nutrition while preserving enough food to last through the remaining winter weeks. You eat slowly, not from any sense of enjoyment or savouring of flavours that barely exist in the bland survival foods available, but because this small amount of food needs to satisfy your hunger for the entire day, and eating quickly would only emphasise how insufficient the portion really is. Your stomach has shrunk from months of reduced eating, adapting to starvation the way the body adapts to any long-term stress, but your body still craves more nutrition than you're able to give it, creating a constant background sensation of emptiness and want that becomes as familiar as breathing. The act of eating becomes ritualistic, each small bite chewed thoroughly and swallowed with attention, as if focus and intention could somehow multiply the nutritional value of the meagre rations. After breakfast, if the weather permits, and there are tasks that absolutely must be done outside, checking on any surviving livestock, gathering fuel from the woodpile, making emergency repairs to the cottage's exterior, you venture beyond your cottage door into a world that seems designed to kill you with methodical efficiency. The wind cuts through your layers of clothing as if they were made of paper, finding every gap and opening in your carefully constructed armour of fabric and wool, stealing body heat with the precision of a skilled thief. Snow and ice make every step treacherous, forcing you to move slowly and deliberately to avoid falls that could result in injury the family cannot afford to treat or accommodate. Your breath freezes in your nostrils, creating ice crystals that make breathing painful and difficult, and your eyes water from the cold, creating tears that freeze on your cheeks and must be wiped away with hands that are themselves too cold to provide much relief. The endless interior days. Many winter days, the weather is too severe to venture outside at all, when blizzards howl with such intensity that opening the door would invite death directly into your home. Blizzards can trap your family in your cottage for days at a time, creating a different kind of survival challenge that tests not just physical endurance, but psychological resilience and social cooperation. When you can't leave your one-room house, shared with multiple family members who are all dealing with their own stress and discomfort, the physical and psychological pressures of winter intensify dramatically, creating conditions that would challenge even the most harmonious family relationships. The cottage that seemed small during warmer months now feels impossibly tiny, like a box that shrinks smaller each day as the walls seem to close in around you. Every family member occupies the same space constantly. There's nowhere to go for privacy, for quiet, for a break from the close physical presence of others who are themselves struggling with cold, hunger, psychological pressure of confinement. The lack of personal space becomes a form of torture that grinds away at everyone's patience and tolerance, making even beloved family members seem irritating and intrusive. Everyone's personal habits become intimately familiar to everyone else in ways that would be embarrassing under normal circumstances, but now simply become part of the shared misery of winter survival. The sounds of people breathing, coughing, shifting position, dealing with bodily functions that cannot be postponed or conducted elsewhere. All of this becomes the soundtrack of your winter existence, a constant reminder that human dignity is another luxury that winter has stripped away. Tempers fray when people are cold, hungry, and trapped together like animals in a cage too small for their numbers. Arguments break out over tiny issues that would be laughable in warmer times. Who's sitting too close to the fire and blocking heat from reaching others? Who took more than their share of food, even when portions are so small that differences are barely measurable? Whose turn it is to tend the flames through the night and risk their sleep for the family's survival? These aren't petty squabbles, but serious disputes that can affect the family's survival if they escalate to the point where cooperation breaks down and family members begin working against each other instead of together. The stress of survival brings out both the best and worst in human nature, and the confined space of the cottage means that every personality, conflict, every old grudge, every source of irritation gets magnified until small issues become major crises that threaten the group's cohesion. Your mother, if she's the family's senior woman and has survived the various dangers that claim women's lives in this harsh world, becomes a diplomatic manager as well as resource coordinator, juggling responsibilities that would challenge a trained negotiator. She must settle disputes with the wisdom of a judge, maintain family harmony with the skill of a diplomat, and ensure that everyone continues to contribute to the group's survival, despite the psychological strain of months in close quarters, without relief or escape. It's a job that requires wisdom accumulated through years of managing family dynamics, patience that must be renewed daily despite her own physical discomfort and emotional stress, and occasional ruthless decision-making when family harmony must be sacrificed for survival necessity. She learns to read the signs of mounting tension before they explode into open conflict, redirecting energy and attention in ways that preserve the cooperation essential for making it through another day. Entertainment during these trap days consists mainly of storytelling, singing, and various forms of handwork that can be done in poor light and cold temperatures that make fine motor control difficult. The stories aren't grand tales of heroes and adventure that might provide escapist fantasy, but practical narratives about survival, cleverness, and the importance of community cooperation that reinforce the values necessary for staying alive. Cautionary tales about people who are too greedy or too careless and paid the price with their lives. Stories that serve as both entertainment and education, teaching lessons about winter survival through memorable characters and dramatic consequences. These stories often feature ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, making them relatable and relevant to your current situation, while providing examples of both successful and failed survival strategies. Your grandmother, if she's still alive, and the odds decrease with each passing winter as age makes survival increasingly difficult, becomes the family's primary storyteller, serving as both entertainer and keeper of cultural memory. She knows tales passed down through generations of peasants, stories that have been refined and perfected through countless tellings until they carry maximum impact and information density. How to recognise the signs of a harsh winter before it arrives, which wild plants can supplement food stores in desperate times and where to find them, how other family families have survived previous terrible winters, and what strategies prove successful or disastrous. Her stories are repositories of practical knowledge disguised as entertainment, teaching survival skills through narrative in a way that makes the information memorable and engaging, even when delivered in the cold, uncomfortable circumstances of winter confinement. The singing serves multiple purposes beyond entertainment, fulfilling social and practical functions that make it essential rather than optional during the long winter months. It helps pass the long hours of darkness when there's insufficient light for handwork and when storytelling voices grow tired from overuse, creating a sense of unity when family tensions run high and cooperation feels strained, and provides a way to remember important information in a society where most people cannot read or write. Many songs contain practical knowledge embedded in their lyrics, which saints to pray to for various problems: how to judge the weather by observing natural signs, when to plant different crops for optimal harvest, how to treat common illnesses with available herbs. In a largely illiterate society, songs serve as a form of cultural memory, preserving and transmitting essential information through melody and rhythm that make complex knowledge easier to remember and pass along to the next generation. The psychology of perpetual cold living in constant cold does things to your mind that people in heated homes can barely imagine, creating changes in cognition and perception that feel as profound as being transformed into a different species entirely. Your thought processes slow down, as if your brain is operating in thick syrup rather than clear air, struggling to form connections and reach conclusions that would be automatic in comfortable temperatures. Decision-making becomes laborious, not because the choices are particularly complex, but because cold affects your mental functioning in ways both subtle and profound, making even simple decisions feel overwhelming and exhausting. The mental fog that settles over you is different from sleepiness or confusion. It's as if your thoughts themselves have become frozen, moving sluggishly through pathways that were once quick and efficient. You find yourself staring at simple problems for long minutes, understanding what needs to be done but unable to summon the mental energy to begin. As if the cold has built walls between intention and action that must be laboriously climbed over rather than simply walked through. You develop a strange relationship with your own body during these months, a disconnection that feels almost mystical in its completeness. Parts of you are numb so often that you sometimes forget they exist until pain suddenly shoots through them as circulation briefly returns, creating moments of startling awareness that you still possess fingers and toes beneath the layers of wrapping and protection. Your hands become clumsy tools that barely respond to your commands, operating with a delay that makes fine work impossible, and even gross motor tasks challenging and unpredictable. You watch your fingers fumble with simple knots or struggle to grasp objects as if you're observing someone else's hands failing to perform basic functions. Your feet are either completely without sensation, like blocks of wood attached to the ends of your legs, or screaming with the particular agony of flesh that's been too cold for too long, a burning, stabbing pain that makes every step a conscious act of will. The disconnect between mind and body becomes so complete that you sometimes look down at your hands in surprise, having forgotten they were attached to you, or find yourself checking to make sure your feet are still there beneath the layers of cloth and crude footwear. Sleep becomes both refuge and challenge, representing the only escape from conscious suffering, while simultaneously presenting its own forms of torment. Your body craves the escape of unconsciousness, the temporary reprieve from cold and hunger that sleep promises, but sleeping in such cold is like trying to rest while being continuously assaulted by an enemy that never increasingly desperate and complex, or move closer to whatever family members can provide additional body heat, creating a constant shuffle of bodies seeking warmth in a space where warmth is always insufficient. The process of falling asleep becomes an exercise in endurance rather than relaxation, requiring you to ignore discomfort that would normally keep anyone awake while finding positions that minimize heat loss without creating new sources of pain or numbness. Dreams during winter take on a particular character that differs dramatically from the normal wanderings of sleeping consciousness. You dream obsessively about warmth, sitting by a roaring fire that actually heats your entire body rather than just the side facing the flames, lying in sunshine so intense you can feel it penetrating through your clothes to warm your skin, being wrapped in more blankets than your family has ever owned, while lying in a room where the air itself doesn't hurt to breathe. These dreams are so vivid and compelling that waking from them becomes a form of grief, a daily loss that must be mourned before you can summon the strength to face another day of cold reality. You dream about food with an intensity that borders on hallucination, creating meals in your sleeping mind that are more detailed and satisfying than any food you remember eating in waking life. Sometimes you wake up convinced you can smell bread baking or soup cooking. The sensation's so real you can identify specific spices and ingredients, only to realise it was your sleeping mind creating sensations your body desperately craves, manufacturing hope from the raw materials of memory and longing. The constant hunger affects your personality as well as your physical health, creating changes in temperament that feel permanent and fundamental. You become irritable over small things that would normally roll off you like water, impatient with family members whose only crime is existing in the same space while you suffer, prone to mood swings that swing between resigned acceptance and bitter frustration without warning or apparent cause. Hunger affects judgment in ways that extend far beyond food-related decisions, making it difficult to think clearly about anything other than the immediate need for food and warmth, reducing your mental world to a narrow focus on survival that excludes considerations of future planning, social harmony, or emotional well-being. You find yourself snapping at loved ones for breathing too loudly, taking up too much space near the fire, or simply being present when you want to be alone with your misery. The guilt from these outbursts creates additional psychological pressure, adding shame and self-recrimination to the already overwhelming burden of physical survival. Yet, there's also a strange form of mental adaptation that occurs during these months, a psychological recalibration that allows the human mind to find meaning and satisfaction in circumstances that would have seemed unbearable just months earlier. Your standards for good and bad days adjust to match your circumstances with remarkable plasticity, creating new definitions of success and failure that make survival psychologically possible. A good day becomes one where no one dies from cold or hunger, where the fire doesn't go out despite fuel shortages and inexperienced tending, where there's enough food for everyone to eat something, even if that something wouldn't qualify as a meal under normal circumstances. A great day is one where someone finds a forgotten store of turnips buried under the snow, where the sun shines long enough to provide a tiny bit of additional warmth that penetrates through clothing and creates the illusion of spring's eventual return, or where the wind dies down enough that the cottage feels almost comfortable for a few precious hours. These redefined standards aren't resignation or defeat. They're psychological survival mechanisms that allow you to find hope and satisfaction in incremental improvements rather than becoming paralysed by the vast gulf between current reality and true comfort. March, the cruelest month. March March arrives not with spring's promise, but with winter's final, most vicious assault, like a dying predator that uses its last strength for the most devastating attack possible. This is often the deadliest month of the medieval year, when winter supplies are at their absolute lowest, but the weather remains brutal enough to prevent any relief from the natural world, creating a perfect storm of scarcity and continued hardship that claims more lives than any other time in the seasonal cycle. Your family's carefully rationed stores of food have been stretched to the breaking point and beyond, each decision about consumption requiring calculations that balance current starvation against future death, immediate weakness against long-term survival prospects. Every grain of barley is precious beyond measure, counted and recounted like a miser's treasure. Every withered root, vegetable, a treasure that must be portioned out with mathematical precision that takes into account each family member's size, age, activity level, and likelihood of surviving until spring arrives. The margin for error has disappeared completely, leaving only stark choices between forms of suffering and varieties of risk. This is when families make decisions that will haunt them forever, choices that represent the absolute extremes of human desperation and the breakdown of normal social and economic structures. Do you slaughter your last breeding animal for one good meal that will provide essential protein and warm everyone's belly for the first time in weeks, knowing it means no offspring next year and the potential end of any hope for rebuilding your livestock after winter ends? Do you burn your wooden farming tools for fuel, accepting that spring planting will be impossible without them, but reasoning that reaching spring alive matters more than being able to plant crops that might never grow? These aren't theoretical dilemmas discussed in comfortable rooms by well-fed philosophers. They're daily realities that determine whether your family survives until April, decisions that must be made by people whose judgment is impaired by hunger and cold, whose ability to think clearly about long-term consequences has been compromised by months of survival-focused thinking. Every choice carries the weight of life and death, not just for the immediate future, but for years to come, creating a psychological burden that adds mental anguish to the already overwhelming physical hardships. Your body by this point shows the accumulated damage of months in survival mode, displaying the physical cost of prolonged hardship in ways that would be shocking to anyone from a more comfortable time. You've lost weight you couldn't afford to lose, your frame diminished to the point where clothes hang loose and belts must be tightened to new holes cut with desperate precision, your muscles weakened by inadequate nutrition and constant cold that forces your body to burn whatever fuel it can find just to maintain core temperature, can barely perform the tasks necessary for survival, making every movement an exercise in endurance and willpower. Your immune system, compromised by malnutrition and stress that keeps your body in a constant state of emergency response, makes you vulnerable to every illness that circulates through the village, like death looking for new victims. A simple cold that would be merely annoying in better times can become pneumonia that kills in a matter of days, transforming minor ailments into mortal threats that terrify families already stretched beyond their ability to cope with any additional crises. The psychological pressure reaches its peak during these weeks, creating a form of mental torture that tests human endurance beyond its normal limits. You can almost taste spring's approach. Days are noticeably longer, providing hope that warmth and renewal are theoretically possible. Occasionally, the sun provides genuine warmth for a few minutes that reminds your body what comfort feels like. But you're still trapped in winter's grip, with no guarantee that you'll survive long enough to experience the relief that seems so tantalizingly close. It's like being and sometimes complete emotional shutdown as the mind protects itself from further suffering. This is when people make their most desperate gambles, throwing caution aside in favour of high-risk strategies that might provide salvation or might accelerate disaster. Families might decide to eat their seed grain, reasoning that survival to see spring matters more than having crops to plant when the growing season begins, trading future security for immediate sustenance in a calculation that shows how completely survival thinking has displaced normal planning and resource management. Others might venture out in dangerous weather to search for early spring plants that could supplement their diet, risking death from exposure for the chance of finding a few edible shoots that might provide just enough nutrition to last another week, another day, another hour. These gambles aren't reckless. They're carefully considered risks taken by people who understand that death is certain without action and merely probable with it, making desperate measures seem rational when measured against the alternative of passive starvation. The village during March becomes a community of walking skeletons, people so thin and weak they barely resemble their former selves, transformed by winter into creatures that seem to belong to a different species entirely. Children who were plump and healthy in autumn now look like small, ancient creatures, their eyes too large in gaunt faces that make them appear wise and weary beyond their years, their movements careful and deliberate to conserve energy that must be hoarded like precious fuel. Adults move like elderly people, regardless of their actual age, bent over from months of malnutrition and cold that have compressed their bodies into defensive postures, their gait slow and shuffling, as if every step must be planned and executed with conscious effort. The transformation is so complete that spring arrivals from other villages sometimes don't recognise people they knew well just months earlier, the winter having carved away not just flesh, but something essential about human appearance and vitality. Yet, this is also when community bonds prove their true strength, revealing the underlying networks of mutual support that make survival possible when individual families can no longer sustain themselves through their own resources alone. Families that still have any supplies share with neighbours who have nothing left, understanding that today's generosity might be repaid with tomorrow's survival when their own resources fail. Someone whose fire goes out receives coals from whoever can spare them, creating a circulation of warmth that keeps the entire community alive through shared resources and coordinated effort. The village functions as an extended survival network, where individual family boundaries blur in the face of communal crisis, where normal social hierarchies and economic relationships give way to pure mutual aid based on the understanding that everyone's survival depends on everyone else's continued existence. These bonds aren't sentimental. They're practical alliances forged by necessity and maintained by the knowledge that community survival is the only path to individual survival when winter pushes human endurance beyond its normal limits. The long nights of late winter, the nights in March seem endless, stretching from mid-afternoon to late morning in a darkness that feels thick and oppressive, like being wrapped in heavy cloth that muffles not just light, but hope itself. Your family gathers around the fire pit as shadows lengthen with ominous speed, knowing that the next 12 hours will test everyone's endurance once again in ways that have become grimly familiar, yet never easier to bear. The transition from day to night happens with startling rapidity, as if winter is eager to reclaim even the brief respite that daylight provides, plunging your cottage into a gloom that seems to seep into your bones and settle there like a permanent resident. The fire burns lower now than it did earlier in winter. Fuel supplies are critically low piece of wood or dried dung must be carefully rationed according to calculations that balance current warmth against future survival, immediate comfort against the mathematical certainty that fuel will run out completely if not managed with ruthless precision. You sit as close to the flames as possible without singeing your clothes, a delicate balance that requires constant attention as you try to absorb heat that your body will need to carry you through the cold hours ahead. The warmth penetrates only the side of your body facing the fire, creating a strange sensation of being simultaneously too hot and too cold, roasted on one side while freezing on the other. You rotate periodically like meat on a spit, trying to distribute the precious heat evenly across your body, understanding that this may be the only real warmth you'll experience until dawn breaks and another day of survival begins. The smoke from the fire fills the cottage with a thick haze that makes your eyes water continuously and leaves your throat raw and scratchy, but it's a small price to pay for the warmth that keeps you alive, and you've long since stopped noticing the discomfort of breathing air that's more smoke than oxygen. The acrid smell becomes a comfort, a sign that the fire still burns and death by freezing remains temporarily at bay. Conversation during these evening hours becomes sparse and economical, with words rationed as carefully as food and fuel, because everything requires energy in a world where energy is scarce beyond measure. Speaking requires energy, and energy comes from food, and food is in desperately short supply, creating a harsh mathematics that makes even social interaction a luxury that must be carefully considered before being indulged. When people do talk, voices barely above whispers to conserve breath, and vocal cords that ache from cold air, is usually about practical matters. Who will tend the fire during which portion of the night, and how they'll stay awake despite exhaustion. Whether tomorrow's weather might permit gathering fuel from sources that haven't already been exhausted. How much food remains in the family's stores, and how it should be distributed to maximise survival prospects for the greatest number of people. These conversations have the weight of military planning, with every decision potentially meaning the difference between life and death for family members whose survival hangs by threads so thin they're almost invisible. Your grandmother, if she'd made it this far through winter, and many don't, claimed by the accumulated stress of months that push elderly bodies beyond their capacity to adapt and endure, sits closest to the fire with the particular stillness of someone conserving every calorie for survival, moving only when absolutely necessary, and then with deliberate slowness that shows her understanding of how precious energy has become. She speaks rarely now, her voice weak and raspy from months of cold and inadequate nutrition that have stripped away the strength that once powered animated conversation and lively storytelling, leaving only the whispered remnants of a voice that must be saved for truly essential communication. When she does offer words, they're usually practical advice drawn from decades of winter survival, or gentle encouragement for the younger family members who are struggling with hunger and despair. Brief sentences that carry maximum information and emotional support with minimum energy expenditure. Her presence becomes more symbolic than active, a reminder of persistence and endurance that inspires the family to continue fighting for survival, even when hope seems impossible to maintain. Sleep preparation becomes a family ritual, performed with the seriousness of a religious ceremony, each step carried out with careful attention to detail, because mistakes in the sleeping arrangements can mean death by morning. Every available piece of fabric, blankets worn thin from years of use, cloaks that have been mended multiple times, even extra clothing that can be spared from daily wear, is arranged to create the maximum possible insulation into survival. Family members position themselves to share body heat most effectively, with the smallest children nested between adults for maximum warmth. The largest family members on the outside to provide additional protection from the cold that radiates through the walls despite the fire's presence. The arrangement requires negotiation and compromise, balancing individual comfort against collective survival, personal space against shared warmth. Everyone understands that survival depends on cooperation, that individual preferences must be subordinated to the group's thermal efficiency, creating sleeping arrangements that would be impossibly intimate under normal circumstances, but become necessary survival strategies when death is the alternative to discomfort. The person designated to tend the fire through the night, usually whoever is least able to sleep due to hunger pangs that gnaw relentlessly, cold that penetrates even the best sleeping arrangements, or worry about family members whose breathing seems too shallow or whose bodies seem too still, settles in for long hours of vigilant attention to the flames that represent the thin line between life and death. This is a responsibility that literally holds life and death in the balance, requiring constant attention despite exhaustion that makes concentration nearly impossible, judgment despite mental fog induced by cold and hunger, steady hands despite muscle weakness from malnutrition. Let the fire die during the coldest part of the night, when the darkness reaches its deepest point and the cold achieves maximum intensity, and family members could freeze to death in their sleep, their bodies unable to generate enough heat to survive in an unheated shelter when temperatures plummet to their most dangerous levels. The fire tender sits in a state of meditation-like focus, adding fuel piece by carefully calculated piece, adjusting airflow to maximize heat while conserving fuel, fighting sleep with techniques learned through months of practice at staying awake when every instinct demands rest. April, the slow promise. When April finally arrives, it doesn't announce itself with fanfare or sudden warmth that transforms the world overnight into a place of comfort and plenty. Medieval spring comes as a gradual accumulation of tiny improvements that are barely perceptible from day to day, but unmistakable over the course of weeks when viewed with the desperate attention of people whose survival depends on reading every subtle sign of seasonal change. The first sign isn't temperature, which remains stubbornly cold and often indistinguishable from late winter's cruel grip, but light, days that stretch noticeably longer with each passing sunrise, dawn that comes earlier and seems to arrive with slightly more energy and warmth, evening light that lingers just a bit more each day, creating precious extra minutes of visibility that reduce the crushing oppression of winter's endless darkness. This additional light brings psychological relief that's almost as important as physical warmth, providing hope that the natural world is still capable of change, that winter's dominance isn't permanent, that the cycle of seasons continues despite the feeling that cold and darkness have become the permanent state of existence. The real excitement comes with the first glimpses of new life pushing through the partially thawed ground, tiny miracles of persistence that prove life can triumph over winter's attempt at total domination. Tiny green shoots appearing in sheltered spots where the sun's weak rays manage to warm the soil just enough for dormant seeds to begin their struggle toward light. The first brave wildflowers showing colour after months of brown and grey that made the world seem drained of all vitality and beauty. Birds returning with songs that sound impossibly cheerful after the silent months of winter when even the hardiest creatures seem to have abandoned the frozen landscape. These early signs of spring aren't just aesthetically pleasing, they represent hope incarnate, the promise that winter's grip is finally loosening, that the natural world is preparing to support life again, rather than constantly threatening to destroy it. Each green shoot, each returning bird, each moment of genuine sunlight becomes a small victory against the forces that have dominated your world for months. Proof that endurance and patience can be rewarded with renewal and recovery. More importantly, some of these early plants are edible, providing the first fresh food your body has tasted since the previous autumn, when the last vegetables were harvested and preserved for winter storage. You learn to identify every spring plant that's safe to eat with the desperate expertise of someone whose life depends on accurate botanical knowledge, studying leaves and shoots with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. Wild garlic, with its sharp, pungent flavour that seems impossibly strong and complex after months of bland, preserved food that offered only basic sustenance without pleasure or variety. Young nettle leaves that can be boiled into nutritious soup that provides not just calories, but vitamins and minerals that your body has been craving for months without being able to articulate what it needs. Dandelion greens that taste bitter but provide vitamins your body desperately needs to repair the damage done by months of nutritional deficiency. Their sharpness, a welcome assault on taste buds that have grown accustomed to foods so bland they barely register as having flavour at all. Your first meal containing fresh spring greens is almost overwhelming, creating sensations that your body has nearly forgotten are possible after months of survival eating. After months of preserved, stored, and increasingly stale food that provided calories but little else, your stomach has nearly forgotten how to process anything green and alive. Anything that contains the complex nutrients found in fresh plants, rather than the simple carbohydrates and proteins that have sustained you through winter's trials. The taste is so intense, it's almost shocking. Real flavour after months of subsistence on bland porridge and whatever dried vegetables remained from last year's harvest, now wizened and tough from storage in conditions that preserved them but robbed them of almost everything that made them appetising. Your mouth waters with an intensity that's almost painful, saliva flowing in response to flavours your body recognises as exactly what it needs for recovery and renewal. The meal represents more than nutrition. It's proof that pleasure is still possible, that food can be more than mere fuel, that the world still contains experiences worth surviving winter to enjoy. Your body reacts to these first tastes of fresh food with gratitude that borders on euphoria, physical responses that demonstrate how desperately your system has been craving the nutrients that only fresh plants can provide. The vitamins and minerals you've been lacking for months begin to restore functions you'd forgotten were compromised, repairing damage done by winter's assault on your health and vitality. Your energy increases slightly but noticeably, providing strength for tasks that have been exhausting struggles. Your mood improves as chemical balances in your brain begin to normalise after months of depression induced by malnutrition and darkness. Your skin begins to look less grey and lifeless as circulation improves and cellular repairs processes that have been dormant through winter begin to function again. These changes happen gradually but unmistakably, each day bringing small improvements that accumulate into a sense of returning to life after months of merely surviving, of becoming human again, rather than just a survival mechanism focused entirely on staying alive until the next day. But spring's arrival is gradual and uncertain, requiring continued vigilance and patience from people whose reserves of both have been exhausted by winter's trials. Cold snaps can still kill the tender new growth you're counting on for survival, sending temperatures plummeting and covering delicate shoots with ice that destroys weeks of progress in a single night of unseasonable snowstorms can undo weeks of progress toward warmth and renewal, covering the ground again with white death that makes foraging impossible and reminds you that winter hasn't truly released its grip on your world. April requires patience and continued vigilance. Winter isn't truly over until it's definitively over, and making assumptions about spring's permanence can be fatal for people whose survival depends on accurate assessment of seasonal conditions rather than wishful thinking. The transition from winter to spring becomes a test of judgment as much as endurance, requiring you to balance hope against realism, optimism against the hard-learned lesson that nature can be cruel and unpredictable, promising relief one day and delivering deadly cold the next. The wisdom of winter survival. By the time spring establishes itself firmly enough to trust, when the danger of killing frosts has passed and the earth has warmed sufficiently to support consistent new growth, you've learned lessons about human endurance that people in comfortable societies never discover, wisdom that can only be gained through the crucible of genuine hardship. You know exactly how little food your body actually needs to continue functioning, not the comfortable portions that satisfy hunger and pleasure, but the minimal caloric intake required to maintain basic life processes and essential activities. This knowledge isn't theoretical. It's been tested through months of practical application where miscalculation meant death. You know how much cold you can tolerate before serious damage begins. Understanding the precise signs that indicate when discomfort is transitioning into danger, when numbness signals potential frostbite, when shivering becomes the body's last defense before hypothermia claims your life. You've learned to read your body's signals with the accuracy of a physician, interpreting every sensation as crucial information about your survival prospects. You've discovered how to find small pleasures in improvements so minor they would be invisible to people accustomed to comfort, developing an appreciation for subtleties that most humans never notice or value. The way sunlight falling across your face for just a few extra minutes can lift your spirits dramatically. How a single additional piece of firewood found unexpectedly can create genuine joy that lasts for hours. The profound satisfaction of a slightly larger portion of food, or food that's slightly warmer than usual, or the rare discovery of something with actual flavour after weeks of bland survival rations. These tiny improvements become sources of happiness, more intense than major luxuries, experienced by people who haven't learned to value the basic elements of survival. Your capacity for gratitude has been refined and intensified through months of deprivation, creating an ability to extract maximum emotional and psychological benefit from minimal positive changes in circumstances. You've learned that survival requires both individual determination and community cooperation, a delicate balance that must be maintained constantly to ensure both personal survival and group cohesion. Individual determination provides the willpower to continue fighting when everything seems hopeless, the mental strength to make difficult decisions, the physical endurance to keep working when your body wants to quit. But individual effort alone isn't sufficient. Medieval winter survival depends on complex networks of mutual support that must be carefully maintained despite the psychological stress of prolonged hardship. The families that make it through medieval winter intact are those that balance personal responsibility with mutual support, understanding that each person must contribute to their own survival, while also participating in collective efforts that benefit everyone. They share resources without compromising their own survival, making calculated decisions about generosity that take into account both immediate needs and long-term sustainability. They maintain group cohesion despite the psychological strain of months narration essential for everyone's survival. You've discovered the strange mathematics of medieval fairness, where food is distributed not equally but according to complex calculations based on age, health, and usefulness to family survival. A system that seems harsh to comfortable observers, but makes perfect sense when resources are insufficient for everyone to receive equal portions. Children receive priority when supplies are critically low because they have the best chance of surviving to see many more springs. Their bodies more resilient and adaptable than those of adults who have been worn down by years of hard labour and repeated hardships. Working adults get slightly larger portions because their strength is essential for everyone's survival. Their ability to perform necessary tasks directly affecting the entire family's prospects for making it through winter alive. The elderly often voluntarily reduce their intake to ensure younger family members have enough. A form of love that's both heartbreaking and practical, representing the ultimate sacrifice made by people who understand that their own survival is less important than the survival of those who have more years ahead of them. This isn't callousness or cruelty. It's a rational response to impossible circumstances, a way of maximising the number of family members who survive when saving everyone is mathematically impossible. Most importantly, you've learned to distinguish between genuine hardship and mere inconvenience, between problems that threaten survival and discomforts that are simply unpleasant but not life-threatening. This distinction becomes crucial for maintaining psychological stability and making appropriate responses to different levels of difficulty. When you've lived through months of real hunger that gnaws constantly at your belly and threatens your life, minor food disappointments lose their power to distress you, becoming irrelevant concerns that don't deserve emotional energy. When you've endured cold that genuinely threatens your life, making every moment a struggle for survival, small temperature variations become irrelevant inconveniences that barely register in your consciousness. You develop a hierarchy of concerns based on actual threat level rather than mere discomfort, allowing you to focus your limited energy and attention on problems that actually matter for survival while ignoring difficulties that are merely annoying. This recalibration of what constitutes a real problem versus a minor irritation becomes a permanent change in perspective that affects how you approach your future challenges. The eternal cycle. As spring firmly establishes itself and the immediate threat of winter starvation passes, when warmth returns to the air and food becomes available from natural sources rather than carefully hoarded stores, you might expect pure relief and joy to dominate your emotional landscape. And there is relief, certainly. The profound, bone-deep relief of having survived another winter that claimed some of your neighbours but spared your family. The gratitude that comes from still being alive when death seems so close for so long. The physical relief of warmth penetrating your clothes and reaching your skin. Of food that satisfies rather than merely sustaining. Of sleep that comes from tiredness rather than from the exhaustion of fighting for survival. But survival also brings complex emotions that people who haven't faced genuine mortal danger often don't understand. Psychological responses that are more complicated than simple happiness or gratitude. There's grief for those who didn't make it. Friends, family members, neighbours who simply couldn't hold on through those final brutal weeks of March when winter made its last, most vicious assault on human endurance. Death during medieval winter isn't dramatic or sudden like deaths in warmer seasons. It's usually a slow process of gradual weakening until someone simply stops fighting and lets go, their body finally unable to continue the struggle against cold and hunger that has defined their existence for months. You mourn these losses while feeling guilty about your own survival, wondering what you did right that they did wrong, whether there were decisions you made or actions you took that gave you advantages they lacked, or whether it was simply luck that spared you while claiming them. Survivor's guilt becomes a burden that must be carried alongside the relief of having lived through winter's trials, creating a complex emotional state that mingles gratitude with sorrow, joy with regret. There's also anxiety about next winter, already visible on the horizon, despite the current warmth and plenty that makes survival concerns seem distant and theoretical. Medieval peasants don't have the luxury of living entirely in the present. Survival requires constant planning for the next crisis, and you know with absolute certainty that another winter will come, bringing with it the same challenges, the same desperate choices, the same test of endurance that you've just completed. The knowledge that you'll have to face these trials again creates an underlying tension that never completely disappears, even during the most comfortable moments of spring and summer. You begin planning immediately for next year's survival, calculating what resources must be gathered, what preparations must be made, what lessons from this winter should be applied to improve your chances of surviving the next one. The cycle of preparation and endurance becomes a permanent feature of your existence, a rhythm that governs every decision and colours every experience with awareness of future challenges. But there's also a strange form of pride in having survived something that would break most people, a quiet confidence that comes from discovering your own capacity for endurance under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. You've learned that you can endure hunger that gnaws constantly at your belly and dominates your thoughts, cold that penetrates to your bones and makes every moment a struggle, darkness that seems to last forever and tests your psychological resilience as much as your physical strength. You've discovered reserves of strength and patience you didn't know you possessed, abilities that emerged only when tested by circumstances that demanded everything you had to give and more. You've learned to function when exhausted, to make rational decisions when stressed beyond normal limits, to maintain hope when hopelessness seemed like the only reasonable response to your circumstances. These aren't lessons you would choose to learn, experiences you would voluntarily seek out for their educational value, but having learned them through necessity, you carry them with quiet dignity and hard-won wisdom. This knowledge changes you in ways that can never be undone, creating a perspective on life and death, comfort and hardship that separates you from people who have never faced genuine survival challenges. You understand things about human nature and human capability that most people never discover. Wisdom that can only be gained through direct experience of extremity. You know that survival is possible under conditions that seem impossible, that human beings can adapt to circumstances that appear unsurvivable, that strength and endurance can be found in reserves that only reveal themselves when everything else has been exhausted. This wisdom becomes part of your identity, a source of quiet confidence that helps you face future challenges with the knowledge that you have already survived the worst that life can offer, that you have been tested at the extremes of human endurance and emerged intact, scarred but stronger, changed but still fundamentally yourself. The deep knowledge. Perhaps most importantly, medieval winter teaches you things about what actually matters that people in easy times often miss entirely. Lessons that penetrate far deeper than intellectual understanding to become fundamental changes in how you perceive value, meaning, and purpose in human existence. When survival is genuinely uncertain, when each day brings real questions about whether you'll live to see another sunrise, you learn to find profound satisfaction in simple things that people in comfortable circumstances take for granted or dismiss as unremarkable. A fire that burns steadily through the night becomes a miracle worthy of gratitude that borders on reverence. boundaries against death that never lose their power to inspire relief and joy. These aren't forced attempts at gratitude or philosophical exercises in appreciating the basics. They're genuine emotional responses to experiences that have taught you the true value of things that sustain life. You learn to value community in ways that go beyond mere socializing, beyond the casual friendships and social connections that make life pleasant but not essential. Your neighbours aren't just people you enjoy spending time with, or whose company provides entertainment during boring periods. They're your survival network, the living infrastructure that makes continued existence possible when individual families lack the resources to sustain themselves alone. They represent the difference between life and death when circumstances become desperate, when personal resources fail and survival depends on the willingness of others to share what they have. To provide assistance when assistance becomes the margin between dying and living another day. This understanding of community as survival mechanism rather than social luxury creates bonds that go far deeper than normal friendship. Relationships based on mutual dependence that transcends personal compatibility to become matters of life and death. You learn to see neighbours not just as individuals with their own personalities and quirks, but as essential components of a survival system that functions only when everyone participates and contributes according to their ability. You develop patience of a depth that people in comfortable societies rarely achieve, a form of acceptance that comes from understanding fundamental truths about the nature of hardship and the limits of human control over circumstances. The patient acceptance that comes from understanding that some problems can't be solved quickly, that some hardships simply must be endured rather than fixed, that human ingenuity and determination have limits when confronted with forces larger than individual will or collective effort. Modern people often struggle with this concept, accustomed to immediate solutions and quick fixes that address problems through technology, resources, or organised effort, trained to believe that every difficulty has a solution that can be discovered and implemented if sufficient intelligence and energy are applied. Medieval peasants know that winter lasts exactly as long as winter lasts, and no amount of wishing or complaining will make it shorter. No amount of planning or preparation can eliminate its challenges entirely. No amount of human effort can change the fundamental reality that survival sometimes depends on endurance rather than action, on waiting rather than doing, on accepting what cannot be changed while working steadily on what can be influenced. You learn to appreciate the genuine luxury of enough. Enough food to feel satisfied rather than constantly hungry. Enough warmth to be comfortable rather than constantly fighting cold. Enough security to sleep peacefully rather than waking multiple times each night to check on fires and listen for sounds that might indicate danger. These simple sufficiencies become sources of joy that people surrounded by abundance often can't access, pleasures that require the contrast of deprivation to be fully appreciated and valued. When you've been truly hungry for months, when your stomach has learned to accept constant emptiness as its natural state, a full meal becomes a celebration that engages every sense and emotion, creating satisfaction that goes far beyond mere nutrition to encompass gratitude, relief, and pure physical pleasure. When you've been genuinely cold for so long that warmth becomes a memory rather than an expectation. The sensation of being truly warm penetrates not just your body, but your consciousness, creating a state that feels like ecstasy, like returning to a natural condition you'd forgotten was possible. The appreciation for sufficiency becomes a permanent change in perspective that allows you to find deep satisfaction in states of being that others might consider merely adequate or unremarkable. Your relationship with your own mortality changes through these experiences of survival, transforming abstract concept into a concrete reality that shapes every decision and colours every experience. Death isn't an abstract concept that happens to other people in distant circumstances, something to be considered theoretically or feared in general terms. It's a constant presence that visits your community regularly, like a neighbour making rounds, a neighbour who might call on your family at any time without warning or explanation. You become intimately familiar with death's various forms: the slow weakening that claims the elderly, the sudden illnesses that take the young, the accidents and complications that can end life without regard for age, health, or preparation. This proximity to death, paradoxically, makes life more precious rather than more frightening, creating an intensity of appreciation for existence that people insulated from mortality rarely achieve. Each day you survive becomes a small victory worth acknowledging. Each morning you wake up represents another successful battle against forces that claim others regularly. Each moment of consciousness becomes an opportunity to experience something that could be taken away without notice. This awareness doesn't create morbid preoccupation with death, but rather acute appreciation for life. Understanding that existence is both fragile and valuable, temporary and worth fighting for, uncertain and worth celebrating for exactly as long as it lasts. Rest in the ancient peace. As another winter night settles over your medieval village, as the fire burns low and your family prepares for sleep in your smoke-filled cottage, you understand that tomorrow will bring familiar challenges: the daily negotiation with cold and hunger, the careful management of resources, the small acts of courage required simply to continue existing in a world that regularly reminds you how fragile life really is. Your life may not be easy, may not be long, may not be filled with the comforts and opportunities that people in other times and places take for granted, but it's a life lived with complete engagement in the fundamental business of survival. A life where every day requires genuine effort and every night survived represents real accomplishment. As you settle into your nest of straw and animal skins, sharing warmth with your family, listening to the wind outside and the quiet breathing of people you love, you find your own form of peace. Not the peace of comfort or security, but the deeper peace that comes from knowing you've done what needed to be done, endured what needed to be endured, and found dignity in circumstances that would break people accustomed to easier lives. The fire settles into glowing coals that will need tending through the long night ahead. Someone will wake regularly to feed small sticks to the flames, maintaining the warmth that keeps your family alive until dawn. It's a responsibility that passes from person to person through the winter months, an endless vigil that continues as long as winter threatens and life hangs in the balance. Rest now in the ancient rhythm of survival and endurance. Sleep well, knowing that winter teaches the deepest lessons about what humans can bear and still remain fundamentally human. Rest now as the medieval darkness settles around you, carrying the breath of centuries past. Sleep well, winter survivor. Your strength echoes through time itself until dawn calls you back to another day of quiet heroism. Sleep well in the peace you've earned through endurance until tomorrow brings new tests and new small victories in the endless dance between survival and surrender. Rest now, faithful soul. Your winter story lives on in the peaceful darkness